When several employees want the same weekend or holiday off, a manager has to balance different concerns at once. Availability limits may affect when someone can work. Time-off requests may reflect personal priorities, and the schedule still needs enough qualified people to operate. That leaves a difficult question. When every request cannot be approved, how should the manager make and explain the decision without relying on personal preference or placing the same burden on the same employees? We asked Gemini, Claude, and ChatGPT the same question. Here are 3 practical approaches to handling employee availability and time-off requests as consistently and transparently as possible. Let's begin with Gemini's approach.
First, separate firm availability constraints from discretionary time-off requests. An accepted availability limit, such as a regular class or second job schedule, defines when an employee can normally be scheduled. A time-off request asks for an exception during a period when that employee would otherwise be available. Before reviewing individual preferences, map the baseline staffing needs for the weekend or holiday. Identify the minimum, required roles, opening and closing responsibilities, and any qualifications needed for each shift. This shows which requests can be approved without creating an operational gap. When requests conflict, use a consistent combination of criteria rather than one automatic rule. The manager might consider submission timing, recent approvals and denials, recent assignments to weekends or holidays, and documented significant circumstances. Any exception should be recorded with the reason, so similar situations can be handled consistently later. Build the schedule around the hardest-to-cover qualified roles first. Then look for voluntary swaps, partial approvals, alternate days off, or other adjustments that preserve coverage. Review recent schedules so the same employees are not repeatedly assigned the least popular shifts. Finally, record every request, decision, staffing reason, and approval. Speak with affected employees privately and promptly. Explain the coverage problem and the criteria used without comparing one employee's personal circumstances with another's. When a request is, note it for future rotation and explain any available alternatives so employees can see how the decision was reached even when the result is disappointing.
Next, here is Claude's approach.
Start by separating 2 different things. Accepted availability describes when an employee can normally be scheduled based on established limits such as school, childcare, or another job. A time-off request asks to be excused during a period when the employee would otherwise be available. Those 2 inputs should not be treated as interchangeable. Before reviewing names or personal reasons, define what the schedule actually needs. List the minimum number of employees, required roles, opening and closing duties, and any necessary certifications, training, or keyholder responsibility. You cannot compare competing requests clearly until you know the coverage threshold you are protecting. Next, choose the decision criteria before handling the individual requests. A manager might combine submission timing, recent approvals or denials, recent assignments to unpopular shifts, and documented significant circumstances. No single method, first come, seniority, or rotation, fits every workplace, so any exception should be recorded with a clear reason. Track who has worked weekends, holidays, closings, and other difficult shifts over time. A simple rotation log can reveal when the same few employees are carrying too much of that burden. After protecting the hardest-to-fill qualified roles, consider voluntary swaps, partial approvals, or alternate days off. When the schedule is final, speak with each affected employee privately and promptly. Explain the specific coverage need and the stated criteria behind the decision without sharing another employee's personal information. Keep a written record of the request, decision, reason, exception, and approver. That history makes future decisions easier to explain and helps the process remain more consistent.
Quick question. Does scheduling employee shifts feel harder than it should? With this app, enter your team members and your staffing needs for each day. Then, with one click, generate a draft shift schedule. Try it once and see how much smoother shift planning can feel. Learn more from the link in this channel's About section. And finally, here is ChatGPT's approach.
Start by separating fixed availability from requests. An accepted availability constraint defines when an employee can normally be scheduled. A time-off request or preference asks for an exception during a period when that employee would otherwise be available, so it may or may not be approved. Before reviewing names, define what the business needs for each shift: minimum, required roles, opening or closing responsibility, and qualifications such as status, food safety certification, equipment training, or customer service experience. Then identify which shifts would become understaffed if every request were approved. Use the same decision factors for everyone, but do not rely on one rule in every case. Consider coverage needs, accepted availability, recent approvals and denials, prior assignments to unpopular shifts, and relevant documented circumstances. Exceptions may be appropriate for emergencies or other serious situations, but they should follow company policy and be recorded with the reason. Build the schedule by filling the hardest to cover qualified roles first, then balance the remaining shifts. Review recent schedules so weekends, holidays, closings, and other unpopular shifts are not repeatedly placed on the same employees. When possible, offer voluntary swaps, partial approvals, or alternate days off without pressuring anyone. Record each request, the decision, the staffing reason, any exception, and who approved it. Tell affected employees promptly and privately. Explain the specific coverage problem and the criteria used, not personal opinions or another employee's private circumstances. Invite questions, and correct the decision if new information shows that the original record was incomplete or inaccurate.
Across the three answers, the common starting point is to separate accepted availability limits from time-off requests. Then identify the staffing, roles, and qualifications each shift requires. Managers can then use consistent criteria, document exceptions, and review recent schedules so unpopular shifts do not keep falling on the same employees. Personally, I know the real situation can be less tidy. I may first ask the people I feel most comfortable approaching, and if that fails, I may cover the shift myself. How does your workplace handle competing time-off requests? Share the rules, challenges, or methods that have worked for your team in the comments. Thank you for watching.